What I'm about to tell you about one of Rome's most controversial emperors will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient history. Picture this: a teenage ruler who shocked the Roman Empire by appearing in public dressed as a woman, marrying multiple men in elaborate ceremonies, and ultimately holding a wedding with his favorite stallion, forcing senators to bow down and address the horse as empress. This isn't fiction or exaggerated propaganda. This is the documented reign of Emperor Elagabalus, whose 4-year rule from 218 to 222 CE became one of the most scandalous and bizarre periods in Roman history. The stories that emerged from his court were so outrageous that historians for centuries dismissed them as impossible fabrications. But modern archaeological evidence and careful analysis of contemporary sources have revealed that the reality was even more shocking than the legends suggested. But first, we need to understand how a 14-year-old Syrian priest managed to seize control of the most powerful empire in the world. The year was 217 CE, and the Roman Empire was in chaos. Emperor Caracalla had been assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, leaving behind a power vacuum that would soon be filled by the most unlikely candidate imaginable. In the ancient city of Emesa, in what is now Syria, a teenage boy named Varius Avitus Bassianus served as the high priest of the sun god, Elagabal. This wasn't just any ordinary religious position. The cult of Elagabal was one of the most important in the eastern provinces, and its priests wielded enormous influence over the local population. The boy's grandmother, Julia Maesa, was the sister-in-law of the late Emperor Septimius Severus, making her part of the Severan dynasty that had ruled Rome for over 2 decades. When news of Caracalla's death reached Syria, Julia Maesa saw an opportunity that would change the course of history forever. The political climate in Rome was unstable and dangerous. The new emperor, Macrinus, was deeply unpopular with both the military and the aristocracy. He had never held high office before becoming emperor, and many viewed him as a usurper who had gained power through treachery. The Roman legions stationed in Syria were particularly restless, having lost their beloved commander Caracalla, and facing an uncertain future under Macrinus's leadership. Julia Maesa understood that this discontent could be weaponized, but she needed a compelling candidate to rally behind. Her grandson, despite being only 14 years old, possessed something that could prove invaluable: a claim to the Severan bloodline and an exotic religious mystique that could captivate the superstitious Roman soldiers. The transformation of a Syrian priest into a Roman emperor began with one of the most audacious deceptions in ancient history. Julia Maesa spread rumors throughout the Syrian legions that young Elagabalus was actually the illegitimate son of the murdered Emperor Caracalla. This claim was almost certainly false. Caracalla had never been to Syria during the time of the boy's conception. But it didn't matter. The soldiers wanted to believe it. They had loved Caracalla despite his cruelty, and the idea of restoring his son to the throne appealed to their sense of loyalty and justice. Julia Maesa sweetened the deal with substantial financial incentives, promising each soldier a generous bonus if they supported her grandson's claim to imperial power. On May 16, 218 CE, the Syrian legions proclaimed the 14-year-old Elagabalus as emperor, taking the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus to emphasize his supposed connection to the Antonine dynasty. The speed with which events unfolded was breathtaking. Within weeks, other Eastern legions had joined the rebellion, and Macrinus found himself facing a full-scale civil war. The decisive battle came at Antioch, where Macrinus's forces were decisively defeated. The established emperor fled toward Rome but was captured and executed before he could reach safety. By the summer of 218 CE, a teenage Syrian priest had become the master of the Roman world, setting the stage for one of the most extraordinary and disturbing reigns in imperial history. What happened next would scandalize Roman society and challenge the very foundations of imperial tradition. From the moment Elagabalus arrived in Rome in 219 CE, it became clear that this was no ordinary emperor. His first public appearances shocked the Roman elite to their core. Instead of wearing the traditional toga and military dress of a Roman leader, Elagabalus appeared in flowing silk robes decorated with gold and precious stones, his face painted with cosmetics in the style of Eastern priestesses. His hair was arranged in elaborate feminine styles, and he wore jewelry that would have been considered appropriate only for women. But this was just the beginning of behavior that would become increasingly outrageous and unprecedented. The young emperor's religious practices immediately became a source of controversy and fascination. Elagabalus had brought with him from Syria a massive black meteorite that represented the sun god Elagabal, and he installed this sacred stone in a specially constructed temple on the Palatine Hill. The rituals he performed were unlike anything Romans had ever witnessed. Contemporary sources describe ceremonies involving frenzied dancing, animal sacrifices, and sexual acts performed in public as part of religious worship. Roman citizens, accustomed to the dignified state ceremonies of traditional Roman religion, watched in horror and fascination as their emperor gyrated in women's clothing while performing what they considered to be barbarian rites. But it was Elagabalus's personal relationships that truly shocked Roman society and provided the most scandalous material for historical gossip. The emperor showed no interest in the traditional Roman model of marriage, where a male head of household would take a female wife and produce legitimate heirs. Instead, Elagabalus publicly proclaimed his preference for relationships that defied every social convention of the time. His first shocking act was to marry Hierocles, a former slave who had worked as a chariot driver in the Circus Maximus. This wasn't a private arrangement or a secret liaison. Elagabalus held a formal wedding ceremony, complete with all the traditional Roman marriage rituals, except that he took the role traditionally reserved for the bride. The marriage to Hierocles was celebrated with a lavish public ceremony that left Roman citizens stunned and confused. Elagabalus appeared dressed in a bridal gown, complete with a veil and traditional wedding jewelry. He referred to Hierocles as his husband and insisted that court officials address the former chariot driver with the respect due to an imperial consort. Contemporary historians record that Elagabalus would often appear in public situations where he deferred to Hierocles as the dominant partner in their relationship, behavior that violated every Roman expectation about imperial dignity and masculine authority. The emperor reportedly delighted in the shock and confusion this caused among senators and other officials who were forced to participate in these unprecedented social situations. But Hierocles was not Elagabalus's only male spouse. The emperor also contracted a formal marriage with Zodicus, described by ancient sources as an athlete from Smyrna, who was renowned for the size of his sexual organs. Again, Elagabalus insisted on all the ceremonial aspects of a traditional Roman wedding, appearing in feminine dress and taking what Romans considered to be the submissive role in the relationship. These marriages weren't simply private affairs or symbolic gestures. They were public declarations that challenged the fundamental structure of Roman society and the traditional expectations surrounding imperial behavior. The emperor's apparent desire to transform himself physically into a woman became another source of fascination and horror for contemporary observers. Multiple ancient sources report that Elagabalus consulted with physicians about the possibility of surgical modification to his body, seeking procedures that would give him female characteristics. While the surgical techniques of the time were primitive and dangerous, the mere fact that the emperor was seriously considering such radical alterations to his anatomy was unprecedented in Roman history. He reportedly offered enormous financial rewards to any doctor who could successfully perform what would essentially be ancient gender reassignment surgery. In addition to his consultations with physicians, Elagabalus allegedly experimented with various methods of feminine presentation and behavior modification. He was said to have plucked all the hair from his body to achieve a more feminine appearance and to have practiced feminine mannerisms and speech patterns. Some sources suggest that he took female names in private and insisted that intimate associates refer to him using feminine pronouns, though the linguistic evidence for this is complicated by the nature of Latin grammar and the unreliability of some ancient sources. The emperor's sexual behavior became a constant source of gossip and scandal throughout Rome. Ancient historians, writing with the moral outrage typical of their era, described Elagabalus as insatiable in his sexual appetites and completely indiscriminate in his choice of partners. He was said to frequent the brothels of Rome, not as a customer, but as a worker, delighting in the role reversal and the shock it caused when his identity was discovered. These stories may be exaggerated or entirely fabricated by hostile historians, but they reflect the genuine confusion and disgust that many Romans felt about their emperor's behavior. Perhaps the most infamous and difficult to verify story about Elagabalus involves his alleged marriage to his favorite horse, a stallion named Incitatus. This tale has become one of the most repeated anecdotes about the emperor, though historians debate whether it actually occurred or represents a later embellishment of already shocking factual material. According to the story, Elagabalus became so enamored with his horse that he decided to elevate the animal to imperial status through a formal wedding ceremony. The emperor reportedly appeared in bridal attire for this ceremony, just as he had for his marriages to human partners. The horse wedding, if it actually occurred, was said to have been an elaborate affair involving all the traditional elements of a Roman imperial marriage ceremony. Elagabalus allegedly insisted that senators and other high-ranking officials attend the wedding and pay proper respects to his new spouse. The horse was reportedly given official titles and honors, including being addressed as empress by court officials who were required to treat the animal with the same deference they would show to a human imperial consort. Senators were allegedly forced to kiss the horse's hooves and present expensive gifts, just as they would to celebrate any other imperial marriage. Whether or not the horse marriage actually occurred, the story reflects the genuine atmosphere of chaos and unpredictability that characterized Elagabalus's court. The emperor's behavior was so consistently outrageous and unprecedented that even the most bizarre stories seemed plausible to contemporary observers. The fact that such tales circulated widely and were recorded by multiple ancient historians suggests that the reality of Elagabalus's reign was indeed extraordinary, even if specific details may have been exaggerated or invented. The emperor's religious innovations continued to shock and alienate the Roman establishment throughout his reign. Elagabalus attempted to establish his Syrian sun god as the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon, subordinating Jupiter and the other traditional Roman gods to his Eastern deity. He constructed multiple temples dedicated to Elagabal throughout the city and instituted new religious festivals that incorporated Syrian practices considered foreign and inappropriate by traditional Romans. These religious changes weren't simply matters of personal preference. They represented a fundamental challenge to Roman cultural identity and the religious traditions that had helped maintain social stability for centuries. The emperor's court became a center of excess and extravagance that shocked even Romans accustomed to imperial luxury. Elagabalus reportedly spent enormous sums on personal decoration and entertainment, importing exotic foods,
perfumes, and clothing from across the empire. His banquets were legendary for their excess, featuring rare delicacies and entertainment that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The emperor was said to bathe in wine, sleep on beds made of rose petals, and wear different silk garments for each meal, never wearing the same outfit twice.
These displays of luxury weren't simply personal indulgences. They were political statements that reflected Elagabalus's vision of imperial power and his rejection of traditional Roman values of simplicity and martial virtue. The emperor seemed to delight in shocking the Roman elite and forcing them to participate in activities they found degrading or inappropriate. This created an atmosphere of tension and resentment that would ultimately contribute to his downfall. The military implications of Elagabalus's behavior were particularly serious for the stability of his reign. Roman emperors traditionally maintained their power through the support of the military, and soldiers expected their leader to embody masculine virtues of courage, strength, and military competence. Elagabalus's feminine presentation and apparent lack of interest in military affairs created growing concern among the Praetorian Guard and the legions stationed near Rome. Soldiers who had initially supported the young emperor began to question whether he possessed the qualities necessary to lead the empire effectively. The emperor's relationship with the Roman Senate was equally problematic. Senators who were forced to participate in Elagabalus's unconventional ceremonies and to show respect to his male spouses and possibly his horse found themselves in an impossible position. They could not openly oppose the emperor without risking execution, but their participation in activities they considered degrading undermined their own dignity and authority. This created a situation where the traditional institutions of Roman government were being systematically humiliated and weakened. As Elagabalus's reign continued, opposition began to coalesce around his cousin Severus Alexander, who was being promoted by the same grandmother, Julia Maesa, who had originally engineered Elagabalus's rise to power. Maesa had begun to realize that her grandson's behavior was becoming a threat to the stability of the Severan dynasty and the empire as a whole. Severus Alexander represented a more traditional and acceptable alternative, a young man who could provide continuity with the Severan line while returning to more conventional imperial behavior. The growing opposition to Elagabalus wasn't based solely on moral outrage about his personal behavior. There were legitimate concerns about the emperor's competence and his ability to govern effectively. His focus on religious innovation and personal gratification had left little time or attention for the serious challenges facing the empire, including military threats on the frontiers and economic problems throughout the provinces. The emperor's extravagant spending had also strained the imperial treasury, creating financial pressures that affected the empire's ability to maintain its military and administrative infrastructure. The end of Elagabalus's reign came swiftly and violently in March of 222 CE. The Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit responsible for protecting the emperor, had finally decided that the young ruler had become too great a liability to the empire's stability. The specific trigger for the coup was Elagabalus's apparent attempt to have Severus Alexander assassinated, fearing that his cousin was becoming too popular as an alternative leader.
When word of this plot reached the Praetorians, they decided to act before Elagabalus could eliminate his potential successor. The assassination of Elagabalus was brutal and decisive. The 18-year-old emperor was killed along with his mother, Julia Soaemius, in the Praetorian camp, where they had gone to try to maintain the loyalty of the guards. The soldiers then dragged the emperor's body through the streets of Rome before throwing it into the Tiber River, a treatment that denied him the proper burial rites that were considered essential for the deceased. This posthumous humiliation reflected the depth of anger and disgust that many Romans felt about Elagabalus's reign and behavior. The damnatio memoriae, or official erasure from historical records that followed Elagabalus's death, was particularly thorough. The Senate officially condemned his memory and ordered that his name be removed from inscriptions and official documents. Statues and other representations of the emperor were destroyed or modified to remove his image. This systematic attempt to erase Elagabalus from history was motivated not only by moral outrage, but also by a desire to restore stability and legitimacy to the imperial system. Despite these efforts at historical erasure, the stories of Elagabalus's reign survived in the works of ancient historians, though often filtered through layers of moral condemnation and possible exaggeration. Writers like Cassius Dio and Herodian, who were contemporary with or close to contemporary with the emperor's reign, preserved detailed accounts of his behavior, though their reliability on specific details is often questioned by modern scholars.
The challenge for historians has been separating factual information from propaganda and moral commentary in these ancient sources. Modern historical analysis has attempted to place Elagabalus's behavior in the context of ancient attitudes toward gender, sexuality, and imperial power. Some scholars have suggested that the emperor's actions reflected genuine gender dysphoria or sexual orientation that was incompatible with Roman social expectations. Others have argued that his behavior was primarily a form of religious expression connected to his role as a priest of Elagabal, where gender fluidity may have been more acceptable or even expected. The question of whether Elagabalus was genuinely transgender by modern definitions remains a subject of scholarly debate.
Some historians point to the accounts of his desire for surgical modification and his preference for feminine presentation as evidence of what would now be recognized as gender dysphoria. Others argue that these stories may be exaggerated or misinterpreted, and that the emperor's behavior should be understood primarily in terms of religious or political expression, rather than personal gender identity. Regardless of the modern interpretations of Elagabalus's motivations, his reign represents a unique moment in ancient history, when traditional social and political boundaries were challenged in the most dramatic possible way. The emperor's behavior forced Romans to confront questions about gender, sexuality, power, and cultural identity that most ancient societies rarely had to address so directly. His reign became a kind of social experiment, though one that ultimately failed due to its incompatibility with the expectations and values of Roman society. The legacy of Elagabalus's reign extended far beyond his 4 years in power. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited imperial power and the importance of maintaining traditional Roman values. Later emperors and their advisors were acutely aware of the need to avoid behavior that might remind people of Elagabalus's excesses. The emperor's reign also contributed to ongoing debates about the relationship between Eastern and Western cultures within the Roman Empire, as his Syrian background and religious practices were often blamed for his unconventional behavior. The historical treatment of Elagabalus has evolved significantly over the centuries.
Medieval and early modern historians typically portrayed him as a monster of depravity, whose reign represented everything that was wrong with imperial decadence. Enlightenment writers sometimes used his story to critique absolute monarchy and religious fanaticism. In the 20th and 21st centuries, some historians and popular writers have attempted to rehabilitate his reputation, portraying him as a misunderstood figure whose behavior reflected progressive attitudes toward gender and sexuality that were simply ahead of his time. The truth about Elagabalus probably lies somewhere between the extreme condemnation of ancient sources and the more sympathetic modern interpretations. He was clearly a young person whose behavior challenged fundamental social conventions in ways that made effective governance impossible under the circumstances of his time. Whether his actions reflected genuine personal conviction, religious devotion, deliberate provocation, or simple immaturity remains difficult to determine from the available evidence. What is certain is that Elagabalus's reign represents one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of imperial Rome. For 4 brief years, the most powerful position in the ancient world
was occupied by someone whose behavior defied every expectation about imperial dignity, masculine authority, and cultural propriety. The emperor's marriages to men, his feminine presentation, his religious innovations, and possibly even his marriage to a horse, created a situation that was unprecedented in Roman history and has rarely been paralleled in any society since.
The story of Elagabalus reminds us that history is full of individuals whose actions cannot be easily explained or categorized by the standards of their own time or ours. His reign challenges our assumptions about ancient attitudes toward gender and sexuality, while also demonstrating the powerful constraints that social expectations placed on individual expression, even for those who possessed ultimate political power. Whether we view him as a tragic figure crushed by societal prejudice, a disturbed individual whose behavior threatened social stability, or simply an eccentric whose story has been distorted by hostile sources, Elagabalus remains one of the most fascinating and controversial figures in Roman history. The emperor's brief but memorable reign continues to generate discussion and debate among historians, archaeologists, and popular writers nearly 18 centuries after his death. His story has been retold in novels, films, and academic studies, each generation finding new ways to interpret and understand his extraordinary behavior. In an era when questions of gender identity and sexual orientation are receiving unprecedented attention and acceptance in many societies, the story of Elagabalus provides a unique window into how these issues were perceived and addressed in the ancient world. Perhaps most importantly, the reign of Elagabalus demonstrates the complex relationship between individual behavior and political power in any historical period. The young emperor's personal choices had consequences that extended far beyond his own life, affecting the stability of the Roman Empire and the lives of millions of people throughout the Mediterranean world. His story serves as a reminder that historical events are shaped by human beings, whose motivations and actions are often far more complex and unpredictable than traditional historical narratives might suggest. The scandalous reign of Emperor Elagabalus stands as one of history's most shocking examples of how individual behavior can challenge the very foundations of society and government. In just 4 years, a teenage Syrian priest transformed himself into one of the most controversial rulers in human history, leaving behind a legacy that continues to fascinate and disturb us nearly 2,000 years later. His marriages to men, his apparent desire to become a woman, and his alleged wedding to a horse represent some of the most extraordinary behavior ever recorded in the annals of imperial power. Whether viewed as a tragic figure ahead of his time or a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power, Elagabalus reminds us that history is often stranger and more complex than we might imagine, shaped by individuals whose actions defied every convention of their era and continue to challenge our understanding today.